Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Futurum Tech Podcast. This is Shelley Kramer, your host, and I'm joined today by my colleague and fellow analyst, Sarah Wallace. Today, we're going to talk about the impact 3D printing is having on coronavirus COVID-19 and what's ahead. Before we get started, I need to remind you that this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Over the course of this podcast, we may talk about companies that are publicly traded. We may even reference that fact, and we may talk about their share prices. But please don't take anything that we say as a recommendation about what you should do with your investment dollars. We're not investment advisors, and we ask that you not treat us as such. With that piece of business out of the way, let's talk about 3D printing technology. 3D printing technology really has the potential to impact almost every industry in the world. By the way, that's not really news. But things like creating replacement parts for machines to quickly developing prototypes from scratch, that's the magic of 3D printing. In today's world, when we're dealing with the coronavirus, what we're looking at in terms of 3D solutions are ways to rapidly create protective face shields and respirator masks and ventilator parts and other things. And that makes 3D printing sort of take center stage in many instances. So what is it that makes 3D printing such a great solution? In a word, it's fast. In the space of an incredibly short period of time using 3D printing, it's possible to design, prototype, and produce an idea. Think hours, not days or weeks or longer. And that rapid turnaround time is something that manufacturers mostly can't yet do. So 3D printing is a big deal right now because it can have a big impact on the supply chain, and it can fill these short-term supply gaps that almost every industry is facing right now as we navigate this COVID-19 outbreak. So I want to give you just one example of how 3D printing can provide important solutions in our supply chain problems. Right now, manufacturers of nasal swabs have been struggling to keep up with demand. In my community alone, I live in Kansas City, Missouri. In my community alone, we don't do mass testing because we can't procure the swabs that are needed. These swabs are very different than standard swabs. They need to be long and skinny. They have to be made of synthetic fiber. They have to not contain certain chemicals, and they can't have a wooden shaft. So while hospitals and communities like mine desperately want to ramp up testing, this weak link in the supply chain is a big factor, and it's getting in the way. That's where 3D printing can help. In an interview that I read recently on CNN, HP's Raymond Pastor, who's the acting president of their 3D printing and digital manufacturing, indicated that HP has the capacity to print 1 million swabs a week in the US alone. So that's a 3D printing solution to a really big supply chain problem. And by the way, HP isn't the only company who's gearing up and ready to do this sort of thing. So with that said, while there are a lot of solutions that 3D printing can deliver, there are some limitations of 3D printing, especially right now. Sarah, welcome, and let's talk about that.
Hi, Shelley. I'm glad to be part of this webcast today. So, yeah, you're right. So, as cool as 3D printing is, and it's definitely become more popular, especially during this time of the pandemic, it also has its limitations. So, for instance, the National Institute of Health actually has a hub so that 3D printing companies can upload ideas so that hospitals and different health organizations can actually look at the designs and possibly use them. But the FDA, which is associated with this National Institute of Health hub, also has a warning that, not all 3D printed equipment is the same. Even things like parts for protective masks, there's sort of disclaimer that maybe some of them might not actually, if it's a particular design, meet the qualifications of FDA. So that's something to take note of, especially when there's a consortium or sort of a collaborative hub. And equally important is that some 3D printing equipment might be better than others. So some might not be able be quite as affordable or offer the protection, as I said before, that's needed. And the other thing is, in terms of these manufacturers, especially at some of the bigger companies that are turning some of their plants into 3D printing resources right now, There's different types of cost of equipment. People also say 3D printers can take up a lot of energy. And there's also a bit of a skills gap, right? So you need to know how to operate this equipment. There can be very specific requirements for things like temperature. So it definitely has its challenges, but it does seem as though we have a lot of companies that are stepping up to the task as much as they can. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's really awesome. And one thing that is a limitation, it's not necessarily a limitation, but just something to keep in mind, and I'm sure companies of all sizes are keeping this in mind, is that there's a risk factor involved here. And this is, the negative Nancy part of this conversation, but there is a risk factor. If your company is making equipment for frontline workers or for ventilators or whatever, and something catastrophic happens, I think there's risk associated that, legal teams are taking looks at and that sort of thing. And that's a part of any business operations, but it definitely is. It's not necessarily a limitation of the use of 3D printing. It's just sort of a word of caution that as much as full speed ahead might be, the inclination here, of course, there are things to keep in mind in terms of things that we need to watch out for. So Sarah, I know that you're actually working on a market insight report right now for Futurum that's taking a deep dive into the world of 3D printing. And in researching, preparing for this show, I've also looked at a number of companies that are doing some really cool, some innovative things in the 3D space. And one of them I mentioned, HP and Swabs, a moment ago. But I know that they have developed a 3D printed hands-free door opener. So obviously hands-free, you don't have to use hands to open the door. A mask adjuster clasp that helps make masks more comfortable for frontline healthcare workers and other people wearing them during long periods of time. Face shields, and I see that HP's hospital grade FFP3 face masks are reportedly going to be available soon, and that they're also working on 3D printed parts for field ventilators. So I know HP is doing some interesting things. Sarah, is there another company that's on your radar screen in terms of somebody doing really cool stuff, innovative stuff in the 3D printing realm?
Yeah, sure. So there's Siemens, which already has roots with 3D printing. So they have their additive manufacturing network, and they're so they're connecting users and designers and 3D print service providers to enable faster and simpler production of spare parts for machines like ventilators. So Siemens is also making 3D printers available to the global medical community to speed up design and production during the pandemic. And doctors and hospitals and organizations that are in need of medical devices and designers and service providers can all register for free access to this on their AM network, their additive manufacturing network, which is great. So.
Yeah, I think it's really incredible how many of these companies are, pooling resources and information and making free access to forms and different things. I think that's really cool. I will admit to seeing a number of simulations about sneezes, and especially in the conversations that have been taking place today about the importance of wearing masks. And Dessous Systems is using scientific simulation of the human sneeze to support the development of personal protective equipment products in their 3D experience lab. And it's called a 3D Experience Lab Open COVID-19 online community. And again, it's a collaborative effort that was developed to quickly answer sort of unmet urgent needs during this pandemic. And the simulations that they've developed are being used to demonstrate what happens when a person sneezes. And I swear I'll spend the rest of my life never just taking a common sneeze for granted. But what's cool is that Dessous simulator applications are already used in the aerospace industries and in the automotive industry to generate like a dynamic simulation of fluid and airflow. And so they're using these simulation apps to help understand the flow physics of sneezes. It's not sexy, but it's really super important in terms of how we're using some pre-existing applications and transitioning those to look at the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic and solutions that we can derive as a part of that. And I think that's just really, really awesome. So there are, speaking of 3D printing solutions and how we're using them in the fight against COVID-19. So we've mentioned some big brands that are immersed in the 3D printing space already, but they're certainly not alone. And there are many other companies in the 3D printing space that are really stepping out. Sarah, I know you've done a ton of research on this topic. What are some of the ones that have caught your eye and what they're doing? What are the things that they're doing?
Yeah, sure. So, what's interesting about studying the 3D printing space is that, it's growing even before the pandemic. Projections were saying that the size of the space is going to double every 3 years. So, obviously, we have the sort of bigger companies that we're more familiar with, but there's also a lot of smaller 3D printing companies. And what's been great is during this time, a lot of these smaller companies have collaborated and come together. So, for instance, in the New York City area, there's three 3D printing companies. There's Changeable Creative, MakerBot, and Shapeways, and they've come together to create the COVID Makers Response Coalition. So that's going to help provide 3D printed supplies to area hospitals in need of gear. And right now, this group is printing about 2,000 face shields a day for hospitals in the New York City area, which we know has been quite a hotbed for COVID-19 due to its population density. So that's been great. And then we have a company like Voodoo Manufacturing. That's actually also a New York-based 3D printing startup. And it's repurposed its 5,000-foot facility to mass produce emergency personal protective equipment for the healthcare workers and hospitals in the area as well. And it's also printing about 2,500 face shields weekly for area healthcare workers.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm sorry. What's cool to me about these companies, whether it's the group, the COVID Makers Response Coalition, or you were talking about Voodoo Manufacturing. I don't know if you had mentioned the Combating COVID website that they created, but hospitals and healthcare workers can place their batch orders there, which again to me is just so. It's the way that communities are working together, the way that companies are stepping up, the way that they're not being proprietary or protective about their capabilities or their intellectual property or anything else. They're just really trying to do good, I think is pretty amazing stuff. One of the things that interested me was seeing that Smile Direct Club, one of the largest 3D printing manufacturers in the US. Okay, I wasn't really thinking about this, but it only makes sense, right? I mean, I have two kids wearing Invisalign, so it only makes sense that a company like Smile Direct Club would also be, in the 3D printing business, and they're one of the largest printing manufacturers in the U.S. So they're partnering with medical supply companies and healthcare orgs to also produce things like face shields and respirator valves. We're seeing that out of Minnesota with a company called Proto Labs. They're prioritizing medical orders on their manufacturing floor. Again, they make ventilator parts and components for COVID-19 test kits. A 3D printing firm in California is working with the University of Southern California, San Francisco. They're creating nasal swabs. What are some more, Sarah? I know you have some more on your list of companies you're taking a look at these days.
Yeah, sure. So we even have some of the bigger companies that we usually know for other purposes. So you have Ford Motor Company, which has partnered with GE, and they're actually right now expanding production of ventilators and other critical equipment, and using also things like face shields and other components for personal protection. And it seems as though actually their goal is to assemble over 100,000 face shields a week. So, and another example of an automotive manufacturer is Volkswagen. They've formed a task force to adapt its manufacturing facilities, just very much the way Ford has, and they're leveraging it for more than 125 industrial 3D printers to help make equipment during this time as well. So we see a lot of companies, as you gave example, like Smile Direct, whose has one purpose, but now adapting to help during this time. So.
Well, and we're seeing a lot of that, Ford Motor Company. Why is that so hard to say? Because we never say Ford Motor Company. We just say Ford. But Ford and GE and Volkswagen, this isn't what they do, but they're pivoting quickly. And that's the cool thing that, 3D printing technology allows them to do that. And of course, in many of these instances, they already have industrial 3D printing equipment. So it's sort of not like, starting from scratch. So I think that's an important point. So 3D printing solutions are, generally speaking, affordable. They bring much needed rapid response capabilities into the manufacturing process, and they also help augment gaps in the supply chain, obvious issues today. So the beauty and the strength of 3D printing lies in the fact that in many instances, 3D printers are affordable. And there's a gigantic network of 3D printing enthusiasts. I've seen calls on Facebook just in my own community alone, people who have 3D printers, XYZ hospital is really in need of, and people have just been pitching in from a personal level to help. So you have this huge network. I was looking at a report from the Federation of American Scientists, and the most recent data that I could find was from 2018, but there were 600,000 purchases of 3D printers priced under $5,000 sold in the US alone. Okay. That's a lot of 3D printers. In that same year, there were about 140,000 industrial grade 3D printers sold worldwide. Now, when we're talking about Ford Motor Company, when we're talking about Volkswagen, when we're talking about some of these, big companies, they're obviously using industrial equipment. But I think one of the really cool things about 3D printing and the solutions that it can provide is that there is this spectrum of, smaller, still very capable machines, a network, a little army throughout the United States, actually throughout the world, because the United States is not the only place this is happening, of people who are ready, willing, and able to step in and help. And then some of these bigger companies. But I do think that, before we step away from this conversation, it really is important to point out the skills gap. So maybe some of the good and terrible here is that there is a skills gap from a technical standpoint, but maybe what we're looking at as a result of this embracing of 3D printing in a global way, that maybe we'll quickly see people being trained to, and have more knowledge about this. Doesn't that seem like an inevitable result, Sarah?
It does. And some of the bigger kind of forefront vendors are already working on this, purposely. For instance, HP has its 3D printing as a service. So they're actually going to small to medium-sized businesses and saying, if you don't have your own in-house 3D printing capabilities, but would like to, HP offers the equipment, the support, and also the training for their in-house employees. And then we have another vendor like Proto Labs, who has, you can upload your online, their 3D printing like blueprint online, and they can do it for you. So I do see, to kind of help fill that gap for maybe smaller companies. And that's one of the predictions I see in the future too, is that through this pandemic, and we're seeing how 3D printing is so useful, I think that it'll become considered more of the supply chain for any size business. So.
Yeah, I think that's an incredible upside, certainly if you're in the 3D printing business. But, and I think that, there are other technologies like this that are kind of on people's radar screen, or from a manufacturing standpoint, maybe it's something that you just haven't, maybe you haven't had the budget, maybe you haven't made time, maybe you just haven't had the brain space to analyze, how could we integrate this into our operations? And I think that, last week on the show, Fred and I talked about the fact that we think that it's really important for businesses to use this time right now, as we're kind of slogging through the reality of what the coronavirus means to all of us. And it means something different to all of us in our businesses and our personal lives. But rather than just, quickly getting back to the status quo and the way we've always done things, it's really a good time to just break everything apart and to rethink and to rework your business models now and post-pandemic, so that you can say, we hadn't really made time for 3D printing before. We hadn't really thought about how it might change our business operations, how it might, speed up this process, or it might help fill this gap. But when you can step back and consider things like that, and consider things like 3D printing, I think that we are going to see a lot of change and a lot of transformation. And, we focus on digital transformation a lot, but just transformation in terms of operations. We weren't really thinking about this before, but now we see firsthand what an impact it can have. It only makes sense for us to integrate this, whether it's 3D printing or something else, into our operations. So I think that that's really exciting. It's certainly exciting, I think, if you're in the 3D printing business. So with that, do you have any words of wisdom as we wrap up our conversation on this topic, Sarah? I know I'm really looking forward to your report being out. I'm really looking forward to your report being out. I'm sure it's going to be fantastic. But maybe you have some insights to share before we say goodbye.
Yeah, I would say, kind of as what you said, if you're a business reconsidering your operations and how these capabilities, and as we talked about, there's many consortiums that are, kind of online and free for people to collaborate. Whether it be your business or you want to connect with the university or, a manufacturer, 3D printing manufacturer. So I guess my advice, and as you said, I'm excited to write about this in my report as well. But, now it's, because of this pandemic, it's really made a lot of resources available online that I think are very searchable and can really open up collaboration in the future. So just something to keep in mind and keep a lookout for.
Well, absolutely. And thank you for that. So I will close by saying thank you very much for hanging out with us. It's always a pleasure. All of the things that the coalitions, the groups that we talked about earlier in this show, I will include links to them in the show notes. So you'll have lots of resources there. And then keep an eye out for Sarah's Market Insight reports, upcoming Market Insight report on 3D printing. And I'm sure she'll have a lot of great insights there as well. And with that, this is me signing off. Again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
There will be plenty of more tech topics and tech conversations right here on the Futurum Tech Podcast, FTP. Hit that subscribe button, join us, become part of our community. We would love to hear from you. Check us out, futurumresearch.com or Futurum Tech Podcast. Daniel Newman, Fred McClymans, Olivier Blanchard. We'll see you later.